The cold concrete of the city doesn't care if you freeze. Arthur knew this better than anyone. He had 34 cents to his name and a cardboard mattress. Then, a man in a tailored suit handed him an envelope. Inside, the deed to a crumbling, forgotten castle. The rain in Seattle didn't fall. It hung in the air like a heavy, freezing mist. Arthur Hayes sat under the concrete overhang of the I-5 overpass, his back pressed against a damp support pillar. He was 54, though the deep grooves around his eyes and the gray in his matted beard suggested a man a decade older. He held a lukewarm cup of black coffee, nursing it more for the heat against his cracked palms than the caffeine. Arthur watched the commuters blur past in their dry, heated cars. He didn't envy them anymore. Envy took energy, and he needed every calorie just to keep shivering. It had been 6 years since the bank took the house, 6 years since his wife passed, and 6 years since the slow, inevitable slide into invisibility. On the streets, you weren't a person. You were an obstacle. A shadow fell over his boots. The boots were taped at the toes, the leather flaking away. Arthur didn't look up. Not looking for trouble, buddy. Just staying dry. Arthur Hayes? The voice didn't belong under a bridge. It was crisp, authoritative, carrying the faint hum of expensive dental work and private schools. Arthur tilted his head. The man standing before him wore a charcoal wool trench coat and carried a leather briefcase. His shoes were polished, completely free of the city's grime. He looked at Arthur not with pity, but with a strained clinical detachment. "Who's asking?" Arthur muttered, tightening his grip on the paper cup. "My name is David Brent. I'm an attorney." He reached into his coat and produced a thick, cream-colored envelope. "I represent the estate of Alistair Hayes. Your great-uncle." Arthur let out a dry, rattling cough that scraped his throat. "Don't know an Alistair. You got the wrong bum." "I assure you I do not," Brent said, his jaw tightening. "I've spent 3 months tracking you down. Fingerprint records from your time in the service confirmed it. Alistair Hayes passed away in November. He was a recluse, a hoarder of sorts, living in a rather eccentric property in the Appalachian Mountains of Pennsylvania. He left no will, which means his estate defaults to his next of kin." Arthur stared at the envelope. He didn't reach for it. Hope was a dangerous thing on the streets. It made you careless. "Estate," Arthur echoed. "Meaning what? A rusted-out trailer and a mountain of debt." "Meaning a property locally known as the Keep," Brent replied, stepping half an inch closer to escape the mist. "It is a stone manor. A castle, essentially, built during the coal boom of the late 19th century. It is yours, Mr. Hayes. Free and clear. The deed is in this envelope." Arthur looked from the envelope to the lawyer's face. He looked for the punchline. There was none, just the irritation of a man who wanted to get back to his heated car. Slowly, Arthur's grimy, calloused hand reached out and took the heavy paper. 2 days later, Arthur sat near the back of a Greyhound bus, watching the flat gray landscapes of the Midwest give way to the dense, claustrophobic forests of the East Coast. Brent had given him $200 for travel and food, a calculated petty cash expense, just to be rid of the obligation. Arthur had bought a surplus wool coat, a decent pair of boots from a thrift store, and a hot meal. The rest went to the ticket. He hadn't slept. The envelope sat in his lap, its edges already worn from how many times he had opened it, read the deed and folded it back. Owner in fee simple, Arthur Hayes. The bus dropped him off in a town called Oak Haven, a dying coal settlement clinging to the side of a forested valley. The main street was a collection of boarded-up storefronts and a single, flickering gas station. When Arthur asked the kid behind the counter for directions to the Keep, the boy stopped chewing his gum and pointed up a winding, unpaved logging road. "Good luck," the kid had muttered. The hike took 2 hours. The incline was brutal, the air thin and biting. The road was washed out in several places, swallowed by creeping ivy and fallen pine trees. Arthur's chest heaved, his legs burning, but he pushed on. He wasn't walking toward a home. He was walking toward leverage. He would sell the land, take whatever meager thousands the local developers offered, and rent a warm apartment in a cheap city. That was the plan. Survival. Then, the trees broke. Arthur stopped dead, his breath plumed in the freezing air. It wasn't a manor. It was a fortress. Built from dark, jagged mountain stone, the keep loomed over a sheer drop, surrounded by a suffocating embrace of dead vines. It had 3 towers, but the roof of the westernmost one had completely collapsed, leaving a jagged, broken crown against the gray sky. Windows gaped like missing teeth, completely devoid of glass. The heavy wooden front doors were rotted at the base, hanging crookedly on rusted iron hinges. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a corpse. Arthur walked slowly up the cracked flagstone path. The silence was absolute. He pushed against the heavy wooden door. It groaned, scraping violently against the stone floor. As it yielded, he stepped inside. The air in the grand hall was colder than outside, smelling of wet ash, animal droppings, and decades of neglect. Water dripped rhythmically from a sagging ceiling 3 stories up, pooling on a massive, cracked marble crest inlaid in the floor. Arthur let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed off the damp stone walls. Sell it? Nobody would buy this. It would cost millions just to make it safe to stand in, let alone live in. The county would probably condemn it. He was exactly where he had been in Seattle. Homeless. The only difference was that his bridge was now made of medieval stone. The first night in the keep nearly killed him. Arthur set up his sleeping bag, another thrift store purchase, in what used to be the main drawing room. It was the only room on the ground floor with a partially intact ceiling and a massive, cavernous fireplace. He spent hours dragging dead, wet wood from the surrounding forest, struggling to get a fire going. When it finally caught, the smoke refused to draw up the choked chimney, billowing back into the room and stinging his eyes until they watered. He sat close to the weak flames, coughing, huddled in his surplus coat. He ate a cold tin of beans, the metallic taste dulling his hunger, but doing nothing for his spirit. The shadows danced on the peeling, water-damaged wallpaper, revealing glimpses of faded luxury, a shattered chandelier hanging by a single wire, the dark outline of a ruined grand piano in the corner. He pulled Brent's letter from his pocket. The lawyer had been meticulous in washing his hands of the affair. Tucked behind the deed was a tax notice from the county. The property was in arrears. $7,000 were due in 30 days. If unpaid, the county would seize it. Arthur tossed the notice into the fire. He watched the paper curl, blacken, and turn to ash. He had $22 left in his pocket. He didn't have 30 days. He didn't even have 3. When morning broke, sending pale, watery shafts of light through the glassless windows, Arthur woke with a stiff back and a singular purpose. If the property was unsellable, it still had to have parts. Copper piping, antique brass fixtures, iron hinges, scrap. He would gut the place himself, haul the scrap down the mountain, and get enough cash to disappear again. He found a rusted iron crowbar in what looked like a collapsed carriage house. It was heavy, perfectly balanced for destruction. Arthur started methodically. He bypassed the upper floors. The stairs looked like they would give way under the weight of a stray cat, let alone a grown man. He stuck to the ground floor and the servant corridors in the back. The pickings were slim. The place had already been scavenged. Pockets of drywall were torn open, where someone had already ripped out the copper wiring. Bastards left nothing, Arthur muttered, his voice raspy in the dusty air. He found a heavy wooden door tucked beneath the main stairwell. It was locked, but the wood around the latch was spongy with rot. Arthur wedged the crowbar into the gap and leaned his weight on it. The wood splintered with a sharp crack, and the door swung open, revealing a set of stone steps plunging into total darkness. The cellar. He grabbed an old, half-melted candle he had found in the kitchen and struck a match. The meager yellow light cast long, shifting shadows as he descended. The air grew significantly colder, but surprisingly dry. Unlike the damp rot of the floors above, the basement smelled of ancient dust and dry stone. The cellar was massive, matching the footprint of the entire keep. It was a labyrinth of archways and heavy supporting pillars. Wooden wine racks, long empty, lined the walls. Arthur moved slowly, testing the ground with his boots. He tapped the walls with the crowbar, listening for the dull thud of lead pipes. Nothing, just solid rock. He reached the far end of the cellar, an area walled off by a tight, semicircular alcove. Arthur held the candle up. The stone here looked different. The mortar was a lighter shade of gray than the rest of the basement, and the blocks were stacked with a frantic, uneven haste, unlike the meticulous masonry of the outer walls. Arthur frowned. He ran his calloused fingers over the rough surface. It was a relatively new addition, a false wall. He stepped back and swung the heavy crowbar, driving the curved iron beak directly into the center of the masonry. The impact sent a painful shock wave up his arms, rattling his teeth. The stone chipped, but the mortar cracked. Arthur swung again, and again. The physical exertion felt good. It was focused anger. Anger at his uncle, anger at Brent, anger at a world that had ground him down to nothing, and then handed him a pile of rocks as a joke. With a sickening crunch, a large chunk of mortar fell away. Arthur jammed the crowbar into the widening crack and heaved with his entire body. The muscles in his back screamed. A heavy stone block slid backward, tumbling into an empty space behind the wall with a hollow boom. A blast of stale, dead air rushed out of the hole, blowing out Arthur's candle. He stood in absolute darkness, chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs. The silence returning was heavier than before. He fumbled in his pockets, his fingers trembling, and managed to strike another match. He lit the candle and held it up to the ragged hole in the wall. It was just large enough to crawl through. Arthur didn't hesitate. He tossed the crowbar through the gap, lowered his head, and wriggled his broad shoulders through the jagged stones, ignoring the sharp edges tearing at his coat. He tumbled forward onto a smooth, dusty floor. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees, and raised the candle. The light fought against the thick darkness, slowly illuminating the space. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. The crowbar slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly on the floor. It wasn't a dusty storage room. The chamber was perfectly preserved. The walls were lined not with stone, but with polished mahogany paneling. In the center of the room sat a massive oak desk, and upon it, stacked in neat, precise rows, were dozens of heavy canvas sacks sealed with wax. But that wasn't what made Arthur freeze. Hanging on the back wall, illuminated by the flickering yellow light, was a sprawling, intricately drawn map of the surrounding county, and pinned to the very center of it was a photograph of a woman Arthur hadn't seen in 6 years, his wife. The candle wax dripped hot over Arthur's knuckles, but he didn't feel it. His boots felt filled with lead. He closed the distance to the far wall with slow, dragging steps, the flame casting erratic, nervous shadows across the polished mahogany. It was Claire. The photograph was slightly out of focus, taken at a diner in Seattle a year before the diagnosis. She was laughing, holding a coffee cup with both hands, her dark hair falling across her face. Arthur remembered taking that picture. He remembered the smell of the cheap hash browns and the rain streaking the diner window. He reached out. His thick, grime-stained thumb hovered over the paper, terrified that touching it might turn the image to dust. He touched the edge. It was real. How? Arthur's voice was a dry croak in the dead silence of the vault. He turned away from the wall, his chest tight with a phantom ache he had spent 6 years trying to drown in bad whiskey and freezing rain. He moved to the massive oak desk. It was meticulously organized. A heavy brass ledger sat perfectly centered on a green leather blotter. Beside it rested a silver letter opener and a stack of envelopes bound with rough twine. Arthur set the candle down. His hands were shaking. He untied the twine. The top envelope was addressed to Alastair Hayes, written in a looping, elegant cursive that made Arthur's knees go weak. He pulled the letter from the sleeve. The paper was crisp. August 14th. 7 years ago. Dear Alistair, I know you and Arthur haven't spoken since he was a teenager. He's proud and he carries a lot of anger about how the family fractured. I'm writing to you without his knowledge. Please don't tell him. We are struggling. The factory closed and Arthur can't find steady work. It is breaking him. He stares at the wall at night, thinking I'm asleep. He feels like he's failing us. I don't want your money, Alistair. I know you live quietly. But Arthur needs a tether. He needs to know he isn't standing alone in the world. If you could just write to him, give him some advice, or offer him a place to help you maintain that big estate of yours, just to give him purpose, it would save his life. He is a good man. He just needs a foundation. Warmly, Claire. Arthur stared at the ink. A single drop of water. He didn't know if it was condensation from the ceiling or a tear splattered against the parchment, blurring the C in her name. He flipped to the next letter, and the next. There were 6 in total. The final one was dated a month before she died, her handwriting shaky, asking Alistair to watch over Arthur when she was gone. Alistair had known. The old man had known about the eviction, the medical bills, the spiral into homelessness. He had known, and he had done absolutely nothing. A hot, white-hot fury flared in Arthur's chest. He slammed his fist down on the desk, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the confined space. He grabbed the heavy brass ledger and hurled it against the mahogany wall. It struck with a heavy thud, bursting open and scattering loose pages across the floor. He turned his rage to the canvas sacks. They were stacked like sandbags, 50 or more of them. He grabbed the nearest one, a heavy, dust-caked bag, and tore at the wax seal. The fabric ripped. Bundles of paper spilled onto the floor. Arthur froze, his breath catching in his throat. He dropped to his knees, picking up a bundle. It was cash, used, non-sequential $100 bills, wrapped in tight rubber bands that had grown brittle with age. He ripped open another sack, more cash, another, silver bars, heavy and tarnished black, another, stacks of bearer bonds. It wasn't just a safety net. It was a fortune. Tens of millions sitting in the dark, gathering dust, while Arthur slept under a concrete overpass. "You sick, twisted old bastard," Arthur whispered, the anger curdling into a deep, confusing nausea. He crawled over the scattered bills, grabbing the torn ledger from where it had fallen. He smoothed the crumpled pages. It wasn't a bank register. It was a diary. The handwriting was sharp, jagged, and aggressive. October 3rd. Claire is dead. The boy is on the streets. I hired a private investigator to track his movements. He begs for change. He drinks. He gives up. The Hayes blood is weak. If I give him the vault now, he will drink himself to death in a month, or a stranger will put a knife in his ribs for the cash. Wealth is a weapon. In the hands of a weak man, it is suicide. I will let him starve. I will let the world grind him down to the absolute bedrock. If he survives the street, if he outlives me, he will inherit the keep. If he runs from the ruin, he deserves nothing. If he digs in the dirt, he will find the empire. Arthur read the words 3 times. The air in the room felt impossibly thin. Alistair hadn't ignored Claire's plea. He had weaponized it. He had watched Arthur lose everything, waiting to see if the fire inside him would go out entirely, or if it would reduce him to something hard enough to hold an empire. The keep wasn't a practical joke. It was a crucible. Arthur looked at the piles of $100 bills resting in the dirt. He looked back at Claire's smiling face pinned to the map. He didn't feel rich. He felt entirely, utterly hollowed out. He sat on the cold floor of the vault for hours, surrounded by more money than he had ever seen in a dozen lifetimes, and wept until his throat bled. Dawn broke over the Appalachian Mountains, bleeding a pale, icy blue through the glassless windows of the ruined keep. Arthur emerged from the cellar staircase. He was covered in gray dust, his knuckles scraped and bleeding, but his posture had changed. The defeated slouch that had defined his silhouette for 6 years was gone. His spine was straight. His eyes, usually clouded with exhaustion, were hard and clear. His coat pockets were heavy, very heavy. He walked out of the heavy oak doors, stepping into the biting morning air. The storm had passed, leaving the forest dripping and smelling of pine and wet earth. Arthur began the long trek down the washed-out logging road. His legs burned, but the pain felt different today. It wasn't the pain of a body breaking down. It was the pain of a machine turning on after years of rust. It took him an hour and a half to reach Oak Haven. The town was just waking up. A few rusted pickup trucks idled outside the gas station. Arthur walked past them, ignoring the suspicious glares from the locals. He pushed open the door to a small, greasy spoon diner on Main Street. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully, entirely out of place in the grim surroundings. A waitress in a faded pink uniform looked up from the counter. She took in Arthur's taped boots, his ragged beard, and his filthy coat. Her expression tightened into a familiar mask of defensive pity. "Coffee's $2, mister," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut. "And you gotta buy something if you want to sit." Arthur walked to a booth in the back and sat down. The vinyl squeaked under his weight. He reached into his deep coat pocket, pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills, bound by a brittle rubber band, and tossed it onto the formica table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "I'll take the steak and eggs," Arthur said, his voice completely steady. "Coffee, black, and keep the pot coming." The waitress stared at the stack of bills. The blood drained from her face. She didn't say a word, just nodded slowly and hurried to the back. Arthur ate in silence. The food was greasy and oversalted, but it was the best thing he had tasted in a decade. He chewed slowly, letting the protein and the heat knit his frayed nerves back together. When he finished, he peeled a $100 bill from the stack, left it under his empty mug, and walked out. His next stop was a squat brick building 2 blocks down, the Oak Haven County Courthouse. The clerk, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up over a mountain of manila folders as Arthur approached the glass partition. "Help you?" the clerk asked, his eyes immediately dropping to Arthur's tattered clothes. "I have a tax notice," Arthur said, sliding the crumpled, ash-stained paper under the glass. "Property in arrears. The keep." The clerk frowned, adjusting his glasses to read the notice. "Alistair Hayes's place. That property is slated for seizure at the end of the month. Total owed is $7,420, plus late fees." The clerk sighed, looking at Arthur with tired sympathy. "Oh, look, buddy, the county is just going to condemn it. You can't, Arthur reached into his coat. He pulled out one bundle, then another. He fed them under the glass slot, stacking them neatly on the clerk's desk. "Count it," Arthur said. The clerk froze. He looked at the stacks of cash, then up at Arthur, his mouth hanging slightly open. He reached out with trembling fingers, thumbing through the crisp, ancient bills. "I can print a receipt," the clerk stammered, his bureaucratic arrogance entirely evaporated. "Do that," Arthur replied. "And give me the contact information for the best structural engineering firm in the state, and a contractor, someone who doesn't mind driving up a mountain." 30 minutes later, Arthur stood outside the courthouse. The receipt for the paid taxes was folded perfectly in his breast pocket. He looked up at the forested ridge looming over the dying town. From down here, you couldn't see the castle. You could only see the wilderness that had tried to swallow it. Alistair had wanted to see if the world would crush him. The world had certainly tried. The concrete overpasses, the freezing rain, the invisible, silent death of the streets. It had taken everything from him. It had taken Claire. But Arthur wasn't invisible anymore. He began the walk back up the mountain. He didn't look at the washed-out road as an obstacle this time. He looked at it as a driveway that needed paving. He reached the summit just as the midday sun broke through the heavy cloud cover, casting sharp, brilliant light against the dark stone of the keep. It was still a ruin. The roof was still caved in. The doors were still rotting, but as Arthur walked up the cracked flagstone path, he didn't see a corpse. He saw a foundation. He pushed the heavy door open, the sound echoing through the grand hall. He walked past the debris, heading straight for the basement stairs. He had a lifetime of dust to sweep up, and for the first time in 6 years, he had the strength to do it. Arthur was home. Arthur's journey from the forgotten streets to the master of the keep proves that rock bottom can sometimes be a foundation. Oh, did you expect that twist in the vault? If Arthur's story of grit, survival, and unexpected redemption kept you hooked, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a great mystery, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping storytelling. Drop a comment below. What would you have done with Alistair's fortune? See you next time.